So this morning we're going to talk about ecosystem development, and I want to start with talking about Henry Cowells, who was a famous ecologist who came to be an ecologist through kind of a roundabout way. He was in a completely different discipline, but one morning on his way to University of Chicago, uh, got off the train at a specific spot in the Indiana Dunes, and after taking a walk on the dunes, Cowells was changed, and um, then the rest of his life became a study of ecological succession on the dunes, and um, here's why. So what Cowells noticed on the Indiana Dunes near Chicago was that along the shores of Lake Michigan, there was a predictable sequence of vegetation as you went from the water inland. So a predictable sequence where we started with dune grass and then dune grass was followed by pine forests, which were eventually replaced by hardwood forests. And Cowells recognized that this could be a sequence of vegetation development, and this might be a predictable sequence in which ecosystems change through time. So Cowells assumed that communities closest to the lake were the youngest communities, and those were the ones dominated by dune grass, and then the other ones farther away from the lake were older and older communities. And so given enough time, the young communities would eventually develop into those older communities. This was a really important kind of foundational way of thinking about ecosystems, which before this time had largely been classified based on who was there and not based on any sort of ecological process through time. So this marked a shift in how people thought about ecosystems, because especially in Western schools of thought, the dominant approach had been first classification of organisms, then classification of ecosystem types. And then Cowells was among the first to really start thinking in terms of classification of succession stages or changes through time processes. Cowells was best known for being an incredible teacher and mentor. And so perhaps the reason we remember this particular individual so well is that this individual was really good at mentoring other people, particularly women in ecology, who went on to have really successful careers and establish a number of firsts within ecology. So this is one of the reasons we remember Cowells for his mentoring more than we remember him for his actual scholarship, which is fascinating. Of course, today on the shakes of Lake Michigan, we see the influence of anthropogenic influences as well. Smokestacks rising just beyond Cowells Dunes. In the absence of human intervention, though, or maybe even, when we think about human intervention and its role in succession, you can think of succession as progressing from a no-life stage in a primary succession sequence all the way up to a climax stage, which is a self-sustaining stage of succession where an ecosystem is self-perpetuating itself rather than kind of priming the ground for another group of organisms. Anthropogenic influences can set succession back in a secondary succession framework. So you can see situations where, in absence of intervention or disturbance, ecosystems might trend towards a final resting place where they're self-sustaining. But any form of disturbance, including anthropogenic disturbance, could push the system back in terms of its successionary development. This may be kind of a simplistic way of thinking about things, since most disturbances play with a few elements of ecosystem structure, but not all of them at once and not in the same order that natural succession proceeds in, which can be a kind of a complicated concept. But regardless, when the effect of a disturbance is catastrophic and destroys, the majority of life, something like a volcanic eruption, you can end up with a pioneer succession stage. And many of the first thinkers about succession really wanted to think about succession in terms of predictable sequences of vegetation that occur regardless of the specific circumstances that a disturbance takes place in. So if a disturbance is big enough, we go to primary succession. From primary succession, an ecosystem progresses through a predictable series of seers, a seer being a complete sequence, actually, of ecosystem development with distinct seral stages. Secondary succession would happen after a disturbance has altered a community greatly, but it hasn't destroyed all life. And so in that sense, you can think of logging events or clear cuts as being a secondary succession disturbance event that sets a system back to an earlier succession stage without completely resetting it. Some might argue with that now and say, well, a clear cut is actually a pretty novel disturbance type. It's not really setting the ecosystem back so much as altering it pretty dramatically and setting it on a new course. Okay, that's all we want to say about that. Let's move on. I want to talk about one couple in particular that were really important in thinking about succession in the past. And then I want to move back into Northwest ecosystems and start talking about our ecosystem types and succession in our forests in the Northwest. So the first stop I want to make before we get back to our Northwest forests and the next group of pioneers in thinking about succession that I want to bring up are Frederick and Edith Clements. I refer to these guys as the Clementses, and largely I do so because of the strong influence they both had on each other. It was relatively well recognized in their time that these two were a couple, that they mentored students together, they did their research together, they traveled to their research sites together. Edith was generally the mechanic for their little vehicle, for their Ford that they would drive out to Colorado every summer, engineered all sorts of interesting devices like a glove box that would fold down and hold a typewriter so that they could type while they drove the long miles out to their Colorado research sites. Theoretically, what's really important in terms of the Clements contribution is that they had a really dominant influence on thinking about succession in terms of distinct stages and thinking about ecological communities as cohesive, repeatable, predictable units on the landscape. In this way, their thinking about ecosystems was more akin to how we think about species definitions. We know that some species may hybridize and that species is not a perfect unit of biological organization. There's some blurring around the edges, but it's a pretty good one and it's a pretty predictable form of biological organization. And the Clements really believed that we could think of ecosystem as of communities in the same way. And this led to a lot of controversy around words like superorganism that were brought up to discuss how ecosystems might function much like a mega organism rather than just a collection of random individuals. A principal prediction about the community concept as interpreted by the Clements was that we should expect, given absence of disturbance, that as you go along an ecological gradient, a temperature or moisture gradient, you'll have suites of species that have similar tolerances and are kind of self-supporting in the structure of a climax or a final ecosystem, such that they kind of blink in and out together. And so you have these predictable groups of organisms forming a community that you'd see along a gradient that would fade in and out together. If that was the case, if we looked at abundance on the y-axis and any gradient on the x-axis, if each of the colors represented in this graph represented different species, we would see whole communities kind of coming in to being and out of being along the gradient together. And then we'd have these distinct and sharp ecotones where the communities merge at their edges. This largely has not been supported by work following the Clements, but regardless, the idea of the climax community or the ecological community as a predictable unit has persisted, and it's persisted into how we think about our forests here in the Northwest. So when we talk about Northwest forest types, we're going to talk about forest types that are predictable units, as if they have this sort of arrangement, though if you go up any mountain range, you will not find this sort of relationship with organisms and their environment. Instead, it's much more helter-skelter. Organisms have very different environmental tolerances, and they fall out in very different places in the landscape as you progress along gradients. So the ecological community is really a level of, we can think of this as a level of biological organization that's between landscapes and stands in this larger figure. And we're talking about a finer level of designation than a biome. So we talked about biomes as units of organization, as that kind of second greatest unit of organization. Of course, then we have whole landscapes or ecoregions, and then within that we have stands. With maybe within stands or between stands and landscapes, we have ecological communities. If this is a view of the Northwest with reference to biomes that are present in the Northwest, this might be a view that is more associated with types of communities based on vegetation composition. So kind of a finer tooth version of what vegetation communities look like. There are a number of different maps like this that have been produced for the Northwest, for the United States, and in fact for the entire world. And so a lot of our biome descriptions have been revisited multiple times, and an approach to classifying ecological communities like this has been revisited many times. So this is just one of the many maps that are out there characterizing communities. You'll see that in this map, the red, which is where we are in Olympia, Washington, would represent Puget Sound Douglas fir. And I know from working in our forest, this is actually a little bit too coarse of a model. We actually have all sorts of other ecosystem types that are present within that Puget Sound Douglas fir type, community type. Not everything here would naturally progress towards a Douglas fir dominant zone in absence of disturbance. We have grand fir forests on the margins of our on the margins of the Puget Sound. We have probably self-sustaining deciduous or at least hardwood forests such as madrone forests. We have many more prairies that are indicated here than are indicated here in this map. But it gets us a good start, and it kind of matches what we were talking about before, which is that as you go up in elevation or towards the Cascades, you have kind of a predictable sequence of layers of vegetation that are somewhat predictable with climate. And this is certainly true for dominant trees. If we made this map based on understory plants or members of the bryophyte community, for example, we'd have a really different map. And so it's worth recognizing that a lot of this is based on the dominance of forest trees, which were assumed by people like Clements and adopters of more of a community approach to be the representatives and predictable representatives of climax communities, final succession stages. Vegetation zones like this are still used frequently, especially in land management programs, and so you're likely to see these again. In Western Washington, it's worth pointing out what is so unique about our forests. We have really different forests than a lot of other parts of the world, and it's easy to myopically focus on our forests as what forests look like, when in fact we're a relatively small region of mostly temperate rainforest leaning vegetation, or what Robert Michael Pyle has called a green and padded realm. So what's so unique about our forests? Well, our high rainfall is certainly unique in the Western United States, and in fact, in the United States in general, we have uniquely high rainfall. We have few tree species, so although we think of our forests as biodiverse, Northwest forests are actually relatively depauperate of tree diversity. You might find anywhere from 4 to 7 tree species within a given forest stand. That's a really low level of diversity compared to, for example, eastern forests or Valdivian rainforests, which might be more diverse, or rainforests in other parts of the world. Light limitation seems to be the major selective pressure as we go through, as you go through a SEER or a sequence of successional development phases. Light limitation is a big deal here, more than moisture limitation. We might have moisture limitation for some individual species or in some seasons, but by and large, we have so much rainfall that you're more likely to encounter too much moisture rather than too little, but light limitation is ubiquitous within our dark forests. We do tend to have dry summers, and so adaptation to those dry summers has certainly been important throughout the history of these forests. We have exceptional epiphyte abundance, though again, only a few species and really dominated by bryophytes rather than vascular plants, which isn't always the case even for other temperate rainforest systems. We have really high inputs of photosynthetic material, of recently fixed carbon, of course. Even though a lot of our forests are dominated by conifers, they still have an annual leaf litter fall or leaf litter input that is contributing a lot to the forest soil. And because of that, we have relatively fast organic matter development on our forest soils compared to ecosystems in other parts of the world. We have high productivity or high net primary productivity, high plant growth, of course. And we have an abundance of shade-tolerant species, species that are adapted to growing in really low light conditions. All of this also makes for exceptional decomposition conditions. However, we have a number of species that actually resist decomposition in a way that is unique for our forests and other even temperate rainforest systems. There are many tree species that decompose much faster than some of ours, like, for example, Douglas firs or some of our cedars. These species might actually decompose much slower than would be typical in other temperate rainforest systems, resulting in a lot of down woody debris and woody debris structures in our forests. We might hypothesize that low light conditions are probably the dominant force in terms of acting as a filter for filtering out who can be present and who can't be present in an undisturbed forest environment here. The low light conditions can be very limiting in the middle of summer and probably a stronger influence on species succession than nutrients or soils. And the reason we'll say that is that we have similar vegetation types that occur across a range of different soil conditions, different nutrient status conditions, and there's a predictable sequence of vegetation types that or vegetation of species within a forest that are predictable based on light conditions more so than nutrient or soil conditions. The nursery phenomenon is a relatively unique and pretty important component of ecosystem ecology or forest ecology in our systems. The way that formerly living members of the tree community will serve as substrate for growth of new members of our community, especially in our temperate rainforest, is really important. In this photo, you can see a log that is laying over with two trees that appear to be straddling that log. And we would interpret that as those trees were actually seedlings that developed on that log at the start of its decomposition, as soon as it had died, that have grown to kind of overtake it and straddle it. This is a really common phenomenon in temperate rainforest sites on the Olympic Peninsula, for example, but also in forests in and around Olympia. If you have slow decomposing logs or woody debris on the floor, that can serve as a really important niche habitat for species that are seeking light. Just that little bit of lift above the forest floor, above the other competing vegetation into that higher light environment on top of a stump or on top of a log can mean life or death for a seedling. And so that lift is a significant influence, and then we get kind of charismatic structures that develop in our forests as a result of low decomposition and higher light availability on top of those pieces of debris. There are probably really unique nutrient and mycorrhizal associations associated with large woody debris, but a lot of what happens below ground in these forests is still being discovered, so it's still a major frontier. Understanding how mycorrhizal webs or fungal webs permeate these forests, how plants may exchange carbon or nutrients between one another via linkages to symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi. These are really important areas for investigation. There's still a bunch of active research happening. We're better understanding these relationships every year. One thing we do know for sure about these forests is that in absence of large disturbances, it is the small disturbances that really set the stage for diversity, and especially for tree diversity and multiple niches. Because light is so important and because many of our tree species are so large, the felling of one tree or the death of one single tree within a forest can have a large ripple effect on the rest of the ecological community, specifically because light is let in through the forest canopy as soon as a tree falls down, both because of the light that that tree formerly took up in its own canopy and because of other members of the community that are taken out as a result of that tree fall. Because of that, we have really predictable gap fall dynamics. This plays into ecological forestry because we have a number of ecological foresters now on the landscape that are thinking about ways to replicate those kind of tree fall dynamics or large tree fall gaps in their forestry operations, so that instead of doing large clear cuts, they're doing multiple small clear cuts that are simulating what would happen with a natural tree fall gap. In those gaps, you get all sorts of hardwood species or more light adapted species that can come up in that tree fall gap, so really important for diversifying the forest. In the absence of any type of disturbance, the forest might progress only towards late succession shade-loving species. And of course, our forests are really known for their influence on the carbon cycle. We have some of the most carbon-dense forests on the planet, period, full stop. A lot of this has to do with not only the fast rate of photosynthesis that our forests can undergo in a pretty mild climate with a lot of moisture available, but it also has to do with how slow decomposition can occur in a climate that is relatively cool most of the year. It's not so cool that life can't continue or we don't still have some active growth that occurs in the winter, so we're mild in that respect. But it's cool enough that decomposition doesn't proceed as quickly as it would in, say, a tropical system. Because of this, we get accumulation of large amounts of woody biomass that tend to stick around. They don't decompose very fast. The climate is not amenable to them decomposing very fast. When the climate does warm up in the summer and suddenly it's warm enough for decomposition, our moisture disappears and the material starts to dry out. So the result of all those factors kind of combine to make our ecosystems incredibly carbon dense. Really good storage vehicles for carbon on the landscape, which of course is important in a global sense with the global carbon cycle. This is just a fun animation. You can see white carbon dioxide molecules getting fixed as photosynthate in the green dots, which that would represent NPP or net primary productivity. You have water being taken up by the blue dots and then released at the same time. And of course, combined in photosynthesis, being split apart in photosynthesis to contribute to fixed carbon. Okay, that's all we need to say. It's just a fun animation to look at for a while. This is an old figure that a former professor or an emeritus professor at University of Washington has used for a long time. So this is a figure that's been in circulation by many others for a while, but it does a good job of simulating what our expected trajectory is in ecosystem development in Northwest forests. So we're no longer on the shores of Lake Michigan or in the Indiana Dunes or in eastern forests. We are firmly situated here in the Pacific Northwest. And we might ask the question, what does ecosystem development look like here? Well, let's start with fire, because fire is probably the largest footprint, landscape level disturbance that naturally, in absence of human intervention, would play a large role in resetting the stage for secondary forest succession in our region. Volcanic eruptions are important, but they probably have more of a localized influence on cascade forests and less of an influence region-wide. Well, fire is not constrained that way, and so fire is one of these disturbance processes that you can find throughout the entire Northwest, east side of the Cascades, west side of the Cascades, but the return interval might differ. So in our forests, say every 300 to 700 years, we get a major fire that comes through and completely resets stand conditions. Not all trees die in even major forest fires, and we've got good evidence of that in our local forests. And as a result, we have some old wolf trees that tend to stick around for a while following a major disturbance like fire. Gradually through time, because fire opens up the canopy and most trees do die, we end up with only the real sun-loving, shade-intolerant species like Douglas fir that end up really dominating the site. So you end up with these dense stands of Douglas fir that are developing and competing for light resources. Through time, our mature old growth remnants still stick around but become fewer and fewer. the sun-loving Douglas fir or a pioneer species will grow up and start competing amongst each other, so there are fewer of them. And eventually the light green here, shown in light green, shade-tolerant species like cedar and hemlock start to come in and dominate the site. And given enough time, even our sun-loving Douglas firs will start to fade away after 500, 600, 700 years, and the site ends up dominated by more of our shade-tolerant species like cedar and hemlock. So a simplified version of forest succession or a forest development SEER in the Northwest, but one that's worked for a long time. Within this realm of seral stages, we can think about where things like spotted owl habitat come into play. Where are the traditional definitions of old growth? Where do we start calling something old growth or not? Okay, so that's important. Here's another version of a similar approach to the same, a similar graphical approach to the same, with the same goal, demonstrating a ecological SEER in a Northwest forest. This SEER we might call a hypothetical mesarch succession, or kind of a medium moisture succession scenario, where through time we might start with bare soil, we grow into a situation where we have dominance by alder or other broadleaf species. Those are gradually supplanted by Douglas firs after a brief shrub stage, and then eventually the shade tolerance again take over. In this graphic, the arrows are used to indicate how harvesting might actually set a forest back in its ecological development pathway. And we're going to dive into this throughout the quarter in terms of how realistic is that? Can we really think of management as interacting with succession directly this way? Are we really just setting the stage backwards or forwards, or are we doing something completely novel? The same way we just thought about that particular SEER of forest development, we might also think about how we could have dry forest or really wet forest systems that would also develop through time. So in this illustration, this slide, we have three types of forest: a dry forest, a mesarch succession, or kind of a mid-moisture forest, and then we have a really wet forest or a hydrarch succession. And in all cases, all of these forest types here are shown to eventually converge on the climactic climax forest type known as the Western hemlock stage. Along this line of thinking, given enough time, each of these different forest types, regardless of moisture status or nutrient status of these soils, would eventually converge on the same ecosystem type, the same self-perpetuating shade-tolerant forest type, where the species that's in the overstory, the forest species that's in the overstory, is reproducing its young in the understory, which are growing up to again become the overstory, and that could last for thousands of years. So in this line of thinking, soils, moisture status, none of that is really as important as just given enough time, light conditions will do the selection for you and result in a climactic climax ecosystem stage, something that's predictable. A lot of these models for this way of thinking about ecosystem development were developed based on what we call chrono sequences, where ecosystems that were different ages were all compared. So you go to ecosystems that you know have different amounts of time since the last major disturbance, and you see who's dominant at those sites, and you do what's called a space for time substitution. So we can't go back in time 10,000 years and see that a wet environment used to be an environment that's relatively wet used to be a pond, and now it's a cedar bog or a cedar swamp. But what we can do is we can go to a series of sites, from one that has a shallow pond environment to one that's a cedar bog to one that is a cedar and hemlock forest, and we can hypothesize connections between those ecosystems and hypothesize about what might happen given enough time, collect evidence that may or may not support those ideas. So this has been the dominant thinking in the Northwest around how forests develop for a good amount of time. Some of the problems with this, though, are, for example, in the hydrarch succession, example, we have about 10,000 years or more that it might take for a lake or bog system to finally become a cedar swamp, fill in with enough organic material and have enough soil development that then finally it becomes a stable hemlock and cedar forest. We know from pollen studies that most of our forest ecosystem types here haven't been around for more than about 5,000 years in the recent history. So following the last glaciation, there was a period of time in which there was a drier vegetation type that prevailed, and it's only been for about the last 5,000 years that our current hemlock, cedar, Douglas fir forest types have really dominated in this region of the country. That's not to say that they didn't dominate before the last glaciation, so there's more to think about there. Okay, we're going to pause there. That takes us through thinking about ecosystem development in terms of big species composition, or at least dominant tree composition in our Northwest forests. And when we come back, what I want to start thinking about is how carbon and other elements accumulate through time in these systems. And are there some predictable rules for how that might happen no matter what ecosystem you're in? Succession has some predictability with regard to species dominance. It might have more predictability if we back up and think about larger ecosystem properties like the amount of carbon or nutrients that are stored within an ecosystem, or the energetics of that ecosystem.